Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Center for Financial Social Work today for our training on the intersection of race based trauma and financial literacy. Dr. Veronica Hardy is going to share some really wonderful information with you. But before I turn it over to you, I am Rita Wolfson, the founder of Financial Social Work, and we do a free monthly webinar the second Thursday of each month. And we're always happy to have anyone and everyone who's interested in our topic join us. So, this is our guest speaker, Dr. Veronica Hardy. And when we turn this over to her in a few minutes, I've asked her to tell you about her work, who she is, and what she does. And she will do that with you. Just a few of the most commonly asked questions. You can check the chat box for any messages. Leah is handling the technology for us, and she's just fabulous. And I'm always so happy to have her with us. And you can, well, yes, one of the most commonly asked questions is for the slides, but the slides aren't shared. They are proprietary, but you will absolutely have the recording and you'll be able to watch that from our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, or from your email because we will email it to you. You can type your questions in the question box as we go through the training. And at the end, we will try to answer as many as possible. There are no CEs or certificates of attendance for this webinar. It's just a lot of wonderful, useful, helpful information. Okay. I like to begin with our financial social work affirmation that I really feel it captures the essence of the work I've been doing the past 25 years. It goes just for today. I will love myself enough to face my fears, practice self acceptance, and embrace hope. Silence my inner critic, speak my truth, and make peace with myself and my past. Just for today, I will give myself permission to eliminate toxic people, beliefs, and behaviors from my life and prepare for a better tomorrow by healing my relationship with my money and with myself today. So, we are talking about money, and I have been doing this a very long time. So, I always recommend that we center ourselves first, take in a deep breath, and exhale a deep breath. Okay, financial uncertainty. We live with it all the time, but we're living with it more than ever. And of course, our clients are living with it more than ever. And that's why we do these monthly free webinars. But in these very difficult times, we know there's record inflation, although it has gone down a little, but massive food insecurity, growing homelessness, increasing debt and healthcare costs, along with endless other complex financial realities. More Americans than ever need the financial knowledge, motivation, support to cope and heal and deal with their money and with their financial health challenges, their mental health challenges, because we can't separate those. Money is stressful and it's causing problems for many, many people today. So, this graphic indicates that when I started all of this 25 years ago, it felt as if I was just shouting out into the universe financial social work, but no one was listening. But now today, we know that it is more complex, stressful, and traumatic than ever before. We know that no one chooses to have money problems, but most people do. So, why is that? Trust me, I've been asking that why for a long time now. And while we talk about financial literacy, financial education, financial capability, for me, I think the main problem, and certainly there are many, many problems, and we've done many, many webinars, and they're all recorded on our financial social work website, that there's rampant financial illiteracy in this country. And while my cycle of financial illiteracy that I've developed starts with money causes financial problems, stress, and trauma, it isn't exactly the money, it's how we think and feel and relate to the money. But when we have these problems, stress, and trauma, the tendency is to ignore them. Many people see that as a form of self care, although it really isn't, as you know. Avoidance leads to physical, mental, emotional, psychological, and social problems, and they lead to self sabotaging. That's the avoidance and denial. And when that happens, it creates a true money disconnect. And certainly part of that is the fact that we don't interact with cash, we don't see it. I'm always shocked to see the places that don't accept cash. Um, so we don't see it, we don't touch it, and we're able to pretend it's not the problem that it is. And when this happens, the problems escalate and they spiral out of control because money is always the elephant in the room. We are more than halfway through 2022 and we still don't talk about money. We don't have safe places for clients to interact and learn about money. It is always the elephant in the room. And it's because financial health and wellness are about much more than dollars, cents, debt, math, and budgets, or budgets. And you can see the belief that financial literacy is a major factor in financial behavioral health. So, just a little bit on financial social work, and we are going to turn it over to Dr. Hardy, because I know that some of you are new to financial social work and aren't familiar with why we would do a free webinar and the different things that we offer. So financial social work is the intersection of politics, the economy, social work, economic, gender, and social justice. And I feel that those are very relevant to the training we're doing today. We explored the financial health fundamentals. It's heavily psychosocial. We look at the thoughts, feelings, attitudes, beliefs, values, and experiences that drive financial behavior. And financial behavior begins with how we earn, spend, save, share, and borrow. And the truth is that until and unless behavior changes, nothing changes. And that's why I talk about the fact that it's about more than dollars, cents, debt, math, and budgets. It is a behavioral model. And the core of the work addresses the relationship we each have with our money and the relationship we each have with ourselves. It is interactive, reflective, and strength-based. It's holistic, multidisciplinary, and healing. It's hopeful, helpful, and it works really successfully with individual clients and with groups because it is educational, motivational, and supportive. And we have graduates across this country and around the world, which is very exciting for us. And now it gives me just so much pleasure to turn this over to Dr. Hardy. Okay.
Thank you so much, Rita. I really appreciate that introduction. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And just to say a little bit more about myself, in addition to the bio, I have been in social work since 1996, and I have been in this academic field for, it's about 15 years now. And just this topic about race-based trauma is very significant to my heart and what I do. So I just want to say how thankful I am for the amount of attendees and even those who will be basically listening to the playback of this webinar. I appreciate you all being here today. And to learn more about me, I do have my website on this slide, drveronicahardy.com, and there is also veronicahardy.com as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to transition to our next slide. And these are just some of the areas that we are going to discuss today. Beginning with history, history gives us a foundation for understanding about the financial disparities experienced by African American populations. And then discussing that intersection between race-based trauma and finances, kind of what does that look like and what does it mean? And then what are some of the mental and health effects of financial strain on individuals? And then getting into the core of the topic about how to implement financial literacy as a social justice tool. So I want to go ahead and begin with a polling question. So I'm going to go ahead and select it and launch it. And we're going to give some time for everyone to respond, but I'll read it out loud for you as well. And the question is, how knowledgeable are you about historically restrictive real estate practices toward African American populations? Do you believe you're very knowledgeable, adequately knowledgeable, somewhat knowledgeable, or not at all knowledgeable? So I see our poll is filling very quickly. So we'll just give it a couple more seconds. And let's see what we have. So as you can see in our results, I think it kind of splits between adequately knowledgeable and somewhat knowledgeable. So my hope is that as we transition through this presentation today, that you feel your knowledge is going to be increased as a result. So let's get into some of those historical mediators. And just being aware that there are multiple historical factors that have impacted the financial health and wealth of African American populations today. And I'm just going to be able to introduce you to a few. And just keeping in mind that these factors are often systemically embedded in governmental, banking, and real estate practices. So in our upcoming slide, I'm going to highlight a few of the adverse experiences that African American populations have went through that have hindered their economic and financial success, growth, and opportunity. So here's a brief history. You can see 4 key points noted on this slide. So I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview of each one. So as many of you already know, many of the persons of the African American population have ancestry who were oppressed, for lack of better words, through enslavement economics, also referred to as slavery, the slave trade, or more current day terms, human trafficking, which you see I have in parentheses on the slide. Now, this enslavement economics, it occurred for at least 200 years that we are aware of, where human beings from the continent of Africa were purchased and kidnapped and used to economically benefit and prosper other populations basically around the world. So these victims of human trafficking, that's how I refer to it these days, were legally labeled as property and denied their basic human rights. But although many actions took place to fight against this, including the 14th Amendment, which allowed citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which prohibited denial of the right to vote due to race, color, or previous experience of enslavement, these activities did not eliminate systemic practices of discrimination. For example, there still existed biased literacy tests, constitutional quizzes, and even poll taxes that were all designed to keep African Americans from participating in the voting process. So it seems like although there was the right to vote, these barriers were still put into place to keep the populations from voting. And in addition to that, there were also further forms of systemic oppression through government passed laws. And those laws created practices, more social practices, that relegated African Americans to what we refer to as subpar public places. And many of you may be familiar with these laws, some of the nicknames for these laws, which are Jim Crow laws or the Black Codes. So these laws further perpetuated those class and social hierarchies. And keeping in mind that all of this was designed to keep African Americans from participating in and gaining legal, economic, and social structures, success in those structures at that time. So that's that enslavement economics, that first point on the slide. Now, these practices, they did continue for decades, and they regulated African Americans to experience poverty. So that transitions us to our next point in relation to educational disparities. So poverty kind of basically was undergirded due to a lack of access to safe and healthy employment opportunities, lack of access to fair and regular, consistent wages, because many people still went unpaid, wages were denied, and even the lack of access to education. And as many of us know, education is a mechanism to decrease the effects of poverty. It's one mechanism that could help or aid in doing that. It can also aid in enhancing our social and economic advancement, but educational disparities took place through policies and practices that again supported racial inequities, such as what is referred to as segregation, a separation. So keeping in mind, and then from the social work perspective and thinking across the lifespan, that education can affect a person's future career choices, their geographic living location, and your geographic living location can affect your access to resources such as trustworthy and productive medical facilities, or even grocery stores that provide healthy food choices. It can affect someone's choices or options for higher education, pursuing higher education. And then it can also impact someone's overall social, mental, and physical health. So in other words, education can have a significant impact on a person's life trajectory. Now let's move forward to the next point and give you a little history behind discrimination in real estate. So in 2020, and I'm thankful to have the opportunity to share this point, that in 2020, the National Association of Realtors president issued a formal apology for the association's past policies and practices that contributed to racial segregation and inequalities. So there was finally transparency around that. So the National Association of Realtors, also referred to as NAR, was previously known as the National Association of Real Estate Exchanges, and then as the National Association of Real Estate Boards. So this organization opposed what was the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And for many of you who are aware of what the Fair Housing Act focused on, the intent was to protect people from discrimination when they are renting or buying a home, obtaining a mortgage, and engaging in any type of housing related activity. So basically, the historical entity that was the National Association of Realtors would actually seem to want to continue to discriminate by opposing that 1968 Fair Housing Act. Further, the association supported redlining and residential racial segregation by denying loans and insurance to African American populations. And also, African Americans were denied membership to this organization based on race. So those are just some examples of the restrictive practices that took place in regards to real estate. And now one of the final historical examples is discrimination in banking practices. So with this example, it's just important to remember how all of these contribute to the financial disparities that African Americans experience today. And as many of you know, it trickles down. It was so embedded into policies and practices that a lot of this still exists. And many of you may see this as well, but just not as overt as it was during this historical period. So for my last historical example is that of the discriminatory banking practices. So in addition to everything I just noted about discrimination in real estate, such as the denial of loans and insurances, the taking of the full savings of African American account holders also occurred during these times. So for example, and I encourage everyone to take time to look this up as well, there was the Freedmen's Bank. And the Freedmen's Bank was established in 1865 by President Lincoln and the US Congress. And the intention behind the Freedmen's Bank was to support the transition from slavery to no longer being enslaved. So the thought was that this would be a method to help African Americans build their financial knowledge and build their savings. So the bank, it was across 17 states, including Washington, D.C., and reportedly had over 70,000 depositors. And from those depositors, it's reported there were over $57 million in deposits from the African American populations and some cultural institutions as well. However, it was later found that those who were in charge of the bank were engaging in different forms of corruption that went unchecked, as well as risky investments with the depositors' money. As a result, the bank was labeled as failed. It was basically shut down, and all the depositors lost their savings. Over $57 million in deposits, just gone. So this leads to the thought of feelings of mistrust of banking institutions that may exist across African American populations. So these are just some of the examples of economic violence that have continued and in fact affected employment, education, and health disparities among African American populations. But this history also shows how African Americans were marginalized from financial and economic growth opportunities. There were policies, there were laws, it was codified to support this marginalization from financial opportunities. So as a result, this hindered chances for African American families to pass on wealth. And then to also highlight the connection to trauma, all of these examples noted, and remember, these are just a few of the examples, reflect a history of chronic trauma, abuse and maltreatment, what is referred to as cumulative grief, and loss without appropriate outlets to be able to respond to this. So it's just critical to understand, again, just the purpose of this presentation today is about that race-based trauma and the finances. So just what I'm labeling these events as is how they all represent what is referred to as race-based traumatic events throughout our history. And again, as we go through this presentation today, you can feel free to post thoughts and questions in the chat too, because we will hopefully have an opportunity later for a question and answer period. So as you can see before you, I just wanted to put these two graphs up just so you could see. And these come from the Federal Reserve Board. And I would encourage you to visit the Federal Reserve Board website to gain even further information beyond this presentation. But these graphs show both the median and mean net worth of these various racial populations. So you can see, labeled as Black, about $25,000, I believe, for the median net worth, okay? Again, I do invite you to visit the site further, the Federal Reserve Board. Usually there is more of an explanation, in-depth write-up that gives us more insight about how the data was collected and built into these graphs. So this is important to consider when we are thinking about finances across African American populations. So here I'm going to take us to another poll question. So I'm going to pull that up for you and take some time to respond to that question. And I'm just going to read it out loud as well. It says, are you aware of the definition of race-based trauma? Yes, no, or unsure. Okay, so we'll take about 2 more seconds. Right? And we will close the poll and let's share our results. Great. I see the majority, about 61% say yes, 14% no, and 25% unsure. So as I said previously, I hope as we navigate through this presentation that your knowledge will be enhanced as far as what that definition is as well. So I want to open this section of the presentation with just a definition of racism, just so we can all have a foundational understanding. And I pulled this definition just from the Oxford Dictionary. And the Oxford Dictionary states that racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group. Typically one that is in a minority or marginalized population. So we have that definition, we're equipped with that. Now let's consider the definition of race-based trauma in relation to economic violence as a trigger. So on this slide gives you kind of that overview and the characteristics of race-based trauma. And a lot of this is going to sound very similar to the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, also referred to as PTSD. Okay, so I'm just going to navigate through some of this for you. There has to be some kind of externalized, racialized event that causes profound psychological injury, memorable emotional harm, or causes distress. when you think back to the previous slide, our brief history slide, all of those events were externalized, racialized events. I have here in parentheses where it says race-based economic violence. And when you think about economic violence, that refers to when someone has limited access or are marginalized from financial and economic opportunities due to discriminatory practices, inequitable work compensation, and all of this can cause harm to an individual and contribute to distress. Number two says there has to be a trigger. There has to be a threat, something that may be sudden. It may be unexpected or uncontrollable. Again, out of that individual's control, beyond their choice. It can be ongoing, which we refer to as chronic, recurrent, happening over and over and over again, cumulative, meaning building upon itself. Each act builds upon the other, and then causes threats to the person's emotional and physical safety. And remember earlier how I mentioned about education disparities and how that can affect someone across the lifespan, their residential living opportunities, their access to higher education, their access to appropriate medical care. All of this economic violence can contribute to these levels of harm. Okay. And then just to move to point number three, where the person is unable to escape exposure because it, referring to racism, is embedded within the societal system. So it's embedded within the policies, it's embedded within the practices, it's legalized, it's codified into policies, possibly in the workplace. There's implicit bias taking place where the person just can never get out from under it. So that's something else to consider when it comes to race-based trauma. And the point number three is also a key distinguishing factor between race-based trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. With post-traumatic stress disorder, it can generally identify there may have been a trigger, etc. Race-based trauma, the person can't escape the trigger. They're always under or exposed to that trigger. So those were that's the key, one of the key differences between race-based trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. Both are extremely, can be extremely devastating though. I do want to make that point as well. And then point number four. The trauma trigger consists of actions that marginalize based on race. So keeping in mind that there is a racial component. So I put, again, in parentheses, some examples such as redlining, Freedmen's Bank that I mentioned earlier, as well as plagiarism and appropriation, which means stealing the works of others, which happened quite a bit with people who were being enslaved, where their ideas, their developments, their products were stolen, and other people basically financially profited from it and are still profiting today. So just in closing on this slide, overall trauma, whether historical, intergenerational, or current, can impact how a person both interprets and navigates the world. It influences our behaviors. So like I mentioned earlier about the Freedmen's Bank, the sudden closing, can you imagine losing all your savings and it was beyond your control? It's because someone else misused and abused your finances. How would that affect how you navigate banking systems? So keeping all of those points in mind. And there are just some points here that I wanted to be able to highlight how the effects of race-based trauma can be very reflective of various other abusive maltreatment and violent experiences that people transition through current day as well. There could be self-question and ruminating. such as, was it me? Was it my fault? Am I the one to blame? Could I have done something differently? Why did this happen to me? And again, the responses can be very consistent with other forms of abuse and violence, such as workplace bullying, such as child abuse, or even domestic violence, right? And just the last point on the screen goes into how often a person's response is considered pathological, or the person's being hypervigilant. But it's not pathological. This is a reaction to a reality that has happened in that individual's life. And because of that traumatic incident, the person develops certain behaviors that are often referred to as safety behaviors. And that supports the person from their perception in navigating the world and responding to challenges that may come their way in the future. Okay, you can see in this last sentence, it reads, for example, mistrusting financial institutions due to adverse financial experiences. And I just want to give that definition of adverse again to keep us all on that same foundational page. Again, from the Oxford Dictionary, adverse means preventing success or development, harmful or unfavorable. So remembering that economic violence definitely can affect someone's success and ability to build wealth. Now let us transition to the mental and health effects of racism in relationship to financial strain. Grief is a topic that I guess the best word is significantly tend to focus on, whether it's grief in the workplace, grief in our personal lives, etc. But this is also highly relevant when it comes to race-based trauma, when it comes to forms of financial abuse, because there is a hurt and there is a loss that often goes unrecognized. This definition here, I basically pulled pieces of it from one of my books I wrote called The Process of Grief. And I noted that grief is a diverse reaction to a loss. It's not just rooted in our emotions, but it can affect us physically, biologically, spiritually. So there may be shifts in all these areas of a person's life. And whenever we experience some type of loss and our responses in grief, again, it can shift the way we both perceive and navigate the world. And I really want to highlight this last point here, missing what you have been deprived of. How many of you have been deprived of human rights? How many of you have been deprived of access and inclusion, or financial or economic justice? Something that you're lacking in your life that you should have access to, but you're often marginalized from. And then I also wanted to pull the root word for grief, and the definition means to burden. So thinking about a burden and how often people feel like they're carrying a burden, something they just can't come out from under. It's chronic in their lives. And I believe race-based trauma, financial abuse can be one of those things. And then just to provide you with a definition of loss, I just have it noted as a type of separation from an experience, human right, forms of justice, freedoms, idea, object, or a person of significance. So losses can be diverse. Whatever we find significant to our lives can be perceived as a loss. So here I have another poll question for you that I'm going to launch. And again, I will read it out loud as you're making your responses. It says, in your opinion, can financial injustice be considered a type of loss? Okay, so I'm looking at the poll. Let me go ahead and show you what I see as far as the results. It is 100% yes. So I'm thankful that everyone is on one accord and identified that. Good, thank you. On this slide, I simply want to identify there are all different types of losses, as I mentioned. And just in the literature, some losses are identified as primary, some losses are identified as secondary, and the third one is one that I came up with that I refer to as overlooked losses. And again, I wonder how many of those of us attending today have experienced overlooked losses. So let's start at the top with primary losses. Now, primary doesn't mean it's more important than another type of loss. Primary just means that it's often recognized by society. It can be seen. It may be common across many social groups. For example, divorce, job loss, the impact of a hurricane. So that's what's referred to as primary losses. Not that it's more important or more significant than another loss. It's just one that's often recognized by society. Then there are what's referred to as secondary losses. And these are the ones that are considered invisible, internal, within us, and they ripple out from the impact of a primary loss. Okay, so for example, a changed sense of self, a loss of sense of safety, an impact on identity. All right, so if we think of, again, the pandemic, there were many losses of jobs, which could have impacted that sense of self, my identity as the one taking care of my family. So my hope is that you can see how some of those secondary losses that we often experience within us can ripple from a primary loss. Now, let's go to number 3, the overlooked losses. These are rarely, if ever, considered as losses. Okay, they are more than invisible. They are just not considered at all. For example, what we are discussing today, which are financial injustices, human rights, access and inclusion, freedoms, again, even safety, again, these tend to be overlooked. Financial trauma, financial strain. Okay? So it's important to keep all of these types of losses in mind when we do speak about race-based trauma, and when we also speak about different forms of financial abuse or economic violence. Now, how do these types of financial disparities and in accordance with racism contribute to a person's health and wellness? And as you can see here, I pulled a lot of this information from the literature, and these were some of the findings. Symptoms of post-traumatic stress, referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, all right? Symptoms of depression, again, that low mood, that loss of interest in daily activities. It could be difficulty concentrating, feelings of worthlessness, substance use and abuse, often perceived as an unhealthy coping mechanism, suicidal thoughts and attempts, intra and interfamilial relationship disruptions, especially around those finances in the household, because it does cause a lot of stress. It does cause a lot of anxiety, which can result in displaced anger. And then certainly symptoms of anxiety, worry, not knowing how to handle the next bills coming in, or how to organize the finances that I do come in, okay? So again, just to stress again, I have a point at the bottom of this slide that says it impedes the growth and development, health, and life trajectory successes for individuals. Now, this slide, you can see basically a map of the United States. And I just thought this study was very interesting, and that's why I included it here. But I included the link at the bottom of this slide, as well as the title of the study, the authors, and the year. So you will be able to access it and navigate it as well to go deeper into understanding how this information was collected and delivered to us. But this study was focusing on, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, the proportion of Google queries, meaning how often people were searching for discriminatory words, such as what's referred to as the N word, in certain geographic locations. And you can see the different colors. So the red represent some of the very intense areas where these searches were taking place. But what the researchers also found, that there was a high correlation, a high relationship between those red areas and higher rates of African American populations who were experiencing chronic health issues and ailments and health disparities. So that we could probably surmise from that, what is the experience of individuals in those particular areas with the policies and practices that may be taking place. Now let's transition into financial literacy as a social justice tool, the core of our conversation and discussion today. So I want to start off with the definition of financial literacy. And as many of you know, financial literacy can have many definitions. So what I did, I kind of pulled different points and created kind of a broad definition for today, just so we can understand the root of what financial literacy is. And it's based on building confidence, knowledge, and skills in understanding financial concepts and how to responsibly manage our financial resources. So that's kind of just a brief foundation. It can go a lot deeper than that as well, but this is just a brief overview definition of what financial literacy means. But to give you an idea of what financial literacy may look like, I pulled just a few points from the chapters of the book I wrote called Let's Talk About Finances. So I have here, you see 3 points noted on your screen. It says an initial step is to explore your financial story. And in exploring your financial story, this has a lot to do with self-awareness about what has contributed to and affected your relationship with finances. It's kind of an uncovering or unveiling, helping you to really see yourself and your processes. So in studying your relationship with your money, it will better equip you to determine where you would like to create change. So for example, if you wanted to explore your financial story, you may want to ask yourself questions such as, when I reflect on my childhood, what observations do I remember about finances? Or were there any experiences of hurt or struggle related to finances during my childhood? I know when I provide a presentation to several of my students, and it was all about finances, I posed some of these questions, and some identified, when I do look back, finances were connected to struggle, as if there was always the absence of or not enough. And I see how in my life, in adulthood, and how I navigate and support my family, that affects the types of decisions that I make with my finances. So for all of us, when you look back, what message was connected to finances?
Veronica, excuse me, I
Yes.
hate to take even 10 seconds out of this, but if we want any time for Q&A, I don't think we're going to have it. The clock is definitely ticking. Can you try and finish up in 5 minutes?
Oh, yes, I can.
This is fabulous. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll move to the second one. So that was exploring your financial story. Now it's consider what's on your financial resume. That includes pulling a copy of your free credit report so you can see your accounts, your debt, any errors, or even see your credit score. And you get a free credit report every year, and you can go to the website annualcreditreport.com to obtain that. And then there's the side hustle, which I refer to the art of the side hustle, also known as a gig or a side gig. And that's a way to bring in additional income, help pay down debt, and build savings. Okay. But these are just a few points I pulled from the book that build on that idea of financial literacy. However, during this presentation, I want to reimagine financial literacy. As I mentioned, financial literacy is built on confidence, knowledge, skills, and understanding financial management, and this includes saving, borrowing, investing, etc. However, do some of the current financial literacy processes help to perpetuate financial trauma and self-blame? And that's just a question for consideration. So when we consider the definition of financial literacy, it tends to focus on the individual responsibility without specifically acknowledging financial disparities due to systemic inequities. In other words, factors that may be beyond a person's control to save, invest, or borrow. Okay, so it's important to ensure that any financial literacy skills that are being taught are not grounded in processes and biases that have contributed to and helped to sustain financial disparities and race-based trauma. So in reimagining this idea of financial literacy, I'm just going to skip this poll question here. It's just asking about whether social workers have an ethical responsibility to promote social injustice, right? Certainly we do, and you can see I pulled the information and the codes from our NASW Code of Ethics on this screen. We do have the responsibility to do that. But in reimagining financial literacy, here are just a few ideas I noted on this screen. So not just focusing on the individual, but towards the institutions that contribute to financial disparities. So, and targeting them for their particular cultural relevance. So are they taking into consideration economic violence, institutionalized racism, when they are teaching financial literacy tools? For financial institutions, do they realize how they're contributing to financial disparities? As I mentioned earlier, the National Association of Realtors president acknowledged the harm, and now they have put key tools into place to address that, including trainings that focus on implicit bias and discrimination in sales. And then community involvement. I'm just going to give an example. The United Way of Greater High Point, Truist, and an after-school program called LEAP develop financial literacy classes for kids that are free and open to the public. So how can we get the community involved? And the last 2 points on the slide, remembering that education is a vehicle toward enhancing financial situations. So integrating culturally relevant, finance-based knowledge into K through 12 schools and also into our social work curriculum as well. So those are just a few ways that financial literacy could be used as social justice tools. And I welcome the opportunity to learn about ideas that you may have. So here I'm in my closing, and I wanted to leave you with some additional resources. Operational Hope provides tools to promote economic justice,
Sure.
as well as Prosperity Now and the Association of African American Financial Advisors. And that completes my presentation. And again, I just thank everyone for attending.
Well, thank you. We need you back. I have to tell you, we need you back. This is just the beginning. Oh, I have some, we need to talk. Thank you. And I know everybody shares those feelings because no one left the whole presentation, Veronica. Okay, we're going to try and get in a little Q&A. I just wanted to remind you that no one chooses to have money problems, but most people do. and that no one can or needs to know everything about money, but everyone needs to know certain things about money. And certainly tying in somewhat with Dr. Hardy's presentation, the fact is we absolutely positively must all do whatever we can to raise more financially literate men and women. Our children just aren't learning enough of this. Um, we have this monthly webinar, and next month we are launching our financial health and wellness professional community. And the month after, we're doing money and mental health self-care strategies for holiday 2022. No one has ever seen this one before, but this kind of tells you a little bit about the introduction, a kind of an introduction to our membership organization for social workers and helping professionals. We will be providing training, support, and the opportunity to interact with colleagues who share similar work and interests, client populations, and many of the topics that Dr. Hardy trained us on today. So we will be giving away 10 free memberships at that webinar, and you can find it on our website. And we have lots of essays written by our graduates on the website. Our financial social work certification, and Dr. Hardy is a graduate of financial social work, and that's what we do. Have this self-study and self-paced 6-month program that includes everything for $695. And now we can take a few questions. Leah, do we have questions? I'm guessing we do.
We have, yes. Is this list of financial systems exhaustive? What are other ways to generate wealth? It's the first question.
So I see, just to repeat, is this list of financial systems exhausted? What are other ways to generate wealth? So some of the points are, if you can develop passive forms of income. So whether it is renting a space, whether it is engaging in something that you're passionate about. For example, one of mine is writing, but we're going to need those financial skills first. How can we go about saving? How can we go about managing our finances that in ways that benefit our households? And I think even today in contemporary times, there are so many opportunities in this, I guess, internet cyber world that many people are using to build their incomes as well. So I feel like that's one of the newer ways to help build some of that financial wealth.
I think we should also concentrate on our spending and our saving. How we earn, spend, save, share, and borrow. Those are, the components that determine our financial circumstances. And yes, I know Dr. Hardy gave many great suggestions in this training, and you will be able to, take your time reviewing them once you have the recording. Okay, another question?
Yes. Can you please talk about how race-based financial trauma currently impacts BIPOC using a historical lens, as they did not directly experience the historical trauma of the ancestors? Freedmen's Bank, Jim Crow laws, Black Code, and etc.
So thinking about this would reflect intergenerational trauma. So if we just use the Freedmen's Bank as example, and again, there was over $57 million in the bank that could have been that wealth foundation for that family. So thinking how, and then the policies and practices that were in place, and some seem to continue, that marginalize certain populations from building wealth. So thinking how many generations seem like they're starting over, a new starting point, right? When there could have been wealth built that they are building upon, just like other groups have been doing so. So that's one way that we can connect current populations to, say, our ancestors as well, and those long-term effects that take place.
I think
Okay, thank you.
what something I got from your presentation, I mean, that I actually feel strongly about is I want to know about the companies and the businesses or the bank that I'm working with. So when you talk about certain banks being less friendly or considerate, so know about the people that you're doing business with and giving your money to. Is this something that serves you as well as maybe another organization? That's it.
Yeah, thank you. May I ask next question?
Go ahead.
Okay. How do you incorporate addressing how do you incorporate addressing system financial issues when working at the individual level? I work with college students of color one-on-one as well as groups.
I'm sorry, it broke up a little bit on me. I apologize.
I will repeat. I just try to question. So the person is working with college students of color one-on-one as well as groups, and she's asking how do you incorporate addressing system financial issues when working at the individual level.
Okay, so I would recommend definitely starting with the person's financial story, because identifying that financial story, uncovering that narrative, it can also help us to see, are there more so systemic issues versus individual choices or processes that have affected this person's financial situation. And starting with a person's financial story can also help promote their healing process at the same time. Because if we think it is us, if it is me, this is my fault, that can lead to feelings of shame. But recognizing that certain situations are due to outside forces, then that allows you to redirect that energy and start addressing those barriers. So once that awareness is created, now what steps can we do? Teaching people the skills to analyze policies. I think like Rita said earlier about what type of banking institution am I going to? What's their foundation? What is written in that small print? So teaching people the skills to understand the different institutions, how they're interacting with them, and what their processes are, and are certain types of biases taking place. And I'm wondering, Rita, would you like to add anything to that?
I just really think that's so important. I think it's important for so many ways, and for self-esteem and for success, to know that if there's a better choice, a better business, a company, an organization, what is their philosophy? What have they done to help, you know, improve services and circumstances for African Americans or any population? So, yes, thanks for that. And I think we have time for one more question. So, Leah, pick a good one.
Okay, I hope it's a good question. Do you think that because of the race-based financial trauma, unhealthy spending behaviors have developed as a coping mechanism?
I would say that there's another study I wish I had a chance to put into the presentation,
Don't
but
worry,
hopefully
Dr.
next
Hardy,
time.
we're going to get you back by hook or by crook.
But I was thinking there was a study that was conducted on the topics of finances that African Americans are most aware of. And that was primarily borrowing money. So many are not taught all of these other skills, which can come from, remember, some of those historical antecedents of marginalizing, not providing the education. So now that we are aware of some of those barriers and the other skills that we can learn, and finding someone who can teach us financial literacy in a culturally relevant way. Now, what are some of those key skills that I can learn beyond just borrowing, because I want to actually build wealth, okay, versus going deeper into forms of debt. But at the same time, remembering those systemic factors that can affect a person's life positioning.
Excellent point. Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm sure that as much as you wanted to have your particular question answered, just everything that we were able to learn from Dr. Veronica Hardy was just so wonderful. And I know there's lots of people thanking you in the chat box, Veronica. And I hope we'll see you all again at one of our monthly free webinars, and especially at the one that we're going to invite Dr. Harvey back to do for us. So thanks, everybody. Stay well and take care of yourself. Bye now.